good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. There were massive protests in Hamburg, Germany today, where thousands gathered to protest a G20 summit meeting attended by the American president. Police had to use fire hoses to maintain order. 15 police officers were hurt in the ensuing chaos. Earlier in the day, the president received a far warmer reception in Warsaw, Poland, where he spoke to a crowd that would not have been out of place at a rally in Ohio or Oklahoma. Now, speeches like this are always an occasion for a president to say nice things about the country he's visiting, and President Trump did that. But then he went on to do something unusual. He offered a spirited defense of Western civilization from those who seek its destruction. And who exactly would destroy it? Well, radical Islam, of course, ISIS, brain-dead jihadis, and crazy people with bombs. They are a danger to us, the president explained. But they're hardly the whole problem. Maybe the gravest threat we face comes from within. The president put it this way.
We must work together to confront forces, whether they come from inside or out, from the South or the East, that threaten over time to undermine these values and to erase the bonds of culture, faith, and tradition that make us who we are. If left unchecked, these forces will undermine our courage, sap our spirit, and weaken our will to defend ourselves and our societies.
Undermine our courage, sap our spirit. ISIS isn't doing that to us. Our elites are. When they tell us to hate ourselves and our culture and our history, when they teach our children to despise the country that produced them, when they claim that percentage point of annual economic growth is more important than the bonds that connect us to each other. America isn't falling to foreign invaders. It is rotting from within because the people in charge don't think it's worth preserving. You have to love a civilization in order to save it, and they don't. Well, in 141 of the crispest, truest words he has ever spoken, the president reminded the world why the West is worth defending.
We are the fastest and the greatest community. There is nothing like our community of nations. The world has never known anything like our community of nations. We write symphonies. We pursue innovation. We celebrate our ancient heroes, embrace our timeless traditions and customs, and always seek to explore and discover brand new frontiers. We reward brilliance. We strive for excellence and cherish inspiring works of art that honor God. We treasure the rule of law and protect the right to free speech and free expression. We empower women as pillars of our society and of our success. We put faith and family, not government and bureaucracy, at the center of our lives. And we debate everything. We challenge everything. We seek to know everything so that we can better know ourselves. And above all, we value the dignity of every human life, protect the rights of every person, and share the hope of every soul to live in freedom.
Well, you don't hear it that much, but all of that is true. We are different from other societies. We speak freely. We protect the individual. We do write symphonies. We have no reason to be ashamed. We've got a lot of reasons, countless reasons, to be proud, and not just of our wealth. A civilization is not merely the sum of a country's GDP. It's a constellation of values and norms and traditions, heroes and villains, and yes, even religious beliefs. Ours is the most successful and benevolent in human history, but it's still vulnerable. All civilizations are vulnerable. Rome looked invincible at one point, too. It turned out not to be. So it's worth remembering the basics. Western civilization is our birthright. It makes all good things possible. Undefended, it collapses. And so we've got to fight to preserve it, not just with airstrikes, but with a vigorous defense of our common values. Nothing matters more than that. President Trump has his flaws, but to his everlasting credit, he is willing to say all of that out loud, and that's worth something, maybe a lot. Charles Krauthammer is a writer and a columnist and one of the finer fruits of Western civilization, if we can say that. He joins us tonight. Charles, what did you make of this speech?
Well, I'm actually working on a symphony, so I'll let you know. Look, I thought that was his best speech ever.
Not your first.
No, actually, it will be my unfinished symphony, that's for sure. Look, this is the best speech he's given. It was very Reagan-esque. I read the we as not just the United States. It was not so much a speech about American exceptionalism. He kept saying we and you, the Poles, and largely meaning the Europeans, the West. This was a defense of the West. And that's what made it so unusual for Trump. This is the antithesis of his inaugural address, which was about America. He didn't speak about the free world. He spoke about our allies as parasites in that speech. This was a complete overturning of that. This was a return to traditional American universalism, leading the community of nations, meaning NATO, the West, Europe, including, of course, a lot of East Asia, other places as well. And by taking on the mantle of leadership, basically expanding the meaning of Americanism to go beyond our shores, I think it was a huge step and extremely significant.
What was so interesting about it, from my perspective, was not his attack on Islamic extremism, which I think is warranted and good for him for saying so out loud, but identifying the rot within American culture and saying if we don't believe in our own values, then all is lost. There's something about that that's going to offend an awful lot of people, I suspect.
If they read the speech or if they hear it, I'm not sure they will, but I think that is the key. And I would not attribute the sort of lack of faith in our society to our elites. I think it resides more with the left. Now, the left, having had a 50-year program, what they called the March Through the Institutions, had a plan to take over the institutions, the leading ones, the universities, the purveyors of Hollywood, the media, the places where you go to learn, even the museums, for God's sake. And they have succeeded. I wouldn't call that the elites. Yes, they control a lot of the positions of power, but that is the left, and I don't think it applies to conservative elites who have the faith, and I think that was the message of the speech, upholding those. And, as the flip side, that was the most anti-Russian speech since Ronald Reagan. He may have had a few lines on Islamic radicalism, but he was unrelenting in attacking the Russians, which in many ways undoes the vision, the meme, which I think is completely false, of him as essentially an instrument, a Manchurian candidate of the Russians. He not only attacked them for their actions in World War II, he was savage on how they treated the Poles during the 40 years of Cold War. And then he went ahead and basically said, we're here to rescue you from your dependence on Russian gas, because we're not going to use it as a weapon. We're not going to hold you hostage. These people are your enemies. And that was, again, something new and very refreshing.
I think when the history of all this is written, the idea that he's in bed with Putin, while there will be valid criticisms of this administration, that will be the most ludicrous of all. Charles, thanks a lot for that.
My pleasure.
President Trump held his second meeting with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel today. Meanwhile, Europe's migrant crisis continues unabated, accelerated, if anything. Tens of thousands of migrants are still crossing the Mediterranean Sea, and recently, Austria remilitarized its Alpine border with Italy in order to prevent mass migrant arrivals there. Douglas Murray has thought a lot about this. He's the best-selling author of The Strange Death of Europe, and he joins us tonight. So, Douglas, I guess the obvious question, the president meets with Angela Merkel. Has her position on migrants softened at all? It seems to have totally overturned the politics and culture of her country. Has she rethought her views on it?
It certainly has overturned the politics of her country. She imported an extra 2% of the population into her country in a single year in 2015. But, you know, she last year, when she did badly in regional elections, she suddenly said what was reported as an apology. It actually wasn't. She just said, I wish we'd been better prepared for what happened. But, you know, the consequences of what she did in 2015, of opening basically the external borders of Europe to the world, anyone who walked in could get into Europe, is still being felt all the time. You just mentioned, I mean, 12,000 people came into the Italian islands alone just last weekend. This has consequences across the continent. As you mentioned, the Austrians sending troops to the Italian border to reinforce it. Just this past week, the Danish intelligence service said that the major threat to their country comes from the thousands of religious extremists in Sweden. Now, those aren't, you know, crazy Calvinists who are kicking off in Sweden. They're the people who've come recently into Sweden at Angela Merkel's invitation.
There was a New York Times piece today about the president's speech in Warsaw, and in it, because it's basically one long editorial of that paper now, they took a dig at the Polish government for not allowing the migrant flow that Germany and Belgium have. Central and Eastern Europe seem to be holding the line against this. Do you think they'll continue?
Yeah, they have. It's one of the most interesting things about this, I remark upon in my book. Western Europe and Eastern Europe think totally differently about this. You know, a right-wing Prime Minister in Hungary and a left-wing Prime Minister in Slovakia are absolutely as one on the fact they don't want to take in millions of refugees and migrants. They don't think that it's the job of their countries to be a home for anyone in the world who wants to walk in and call their countries home. I don't think that's going to change. And by the way, that sneering of the New York Times and other papers, I mean, they should really reflect on the fact that even some of their sort of cherished figures are starting to realize this. A very interesting development this week. Bill Gates gave an interview to one of the German papers. Now, Bill Gates in 2015 said that America should take in migrants at the same rate that Germany had. But just this week, in a change of tone, Bill Gates said in an interview with a German newspaper that actually Europe obviously cannot survive with the rates of migration that it's got at the moment. And he said, you know, you've got to find a way to stop the boats landing. Now, if everyone is starting to realize this, why don't we start to think now about the ways to solve this? Because, as I say in my book, you know, there are a whole load of things we should have been doing from the beginning. And it was inevitable that people would realize this was a catastrophe, but we have been woefully slow in waking up to it. And I think that the lessons that America in particular has to learn from this are incredibly striking.
Yes, and routinely and assertively ignored by our policymakers, which is why it's so nice to have you on tonight. Douglas Murray, thank you.
Great pleasure to be